this something you learned? Were you born an entrepreneur?
You got to start small.
I have not allowed being a woman to hold me back.
Credibility is not just making money, it's about making sure that people trust what you're doing.
Law practice is not only about going to court, it's about advice.
It's very difficult to hire somebody who's not motivated and then make them motivated.
One of the things that I'm known for is integrity.
They have to see you as a person of integrity.
Welcome to the Executive Lounge. I'm Inshira Adam. Hello and welcome to the Executive Lounge with me, Inshira Ado, your thought leadership show that brings you insights from the lives of men and women who have scaled the daunting heights of starting their own businesses, managing or growing institutions right here at home and around the world. We feature some great thinkers, and my guest on the show today is a multidisciplinary scholar. He's a thinker. He is also a social entrepreneur, an innovator, and today we're going to explore how we can apply innovation to ensure that we're empowering young people to do well in the coming demographic dividend. Sarbah is my guest, and you're welcome to the Executive Lounge.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you. And, reading about you on the Harvard Gazette, fantastic story. You literally pulled yourself up by your bootstraps and took the opportunities life gave you. A lot of talk about young people and the future and what we need to do to ensure that they're ready to make a difference in the future. The question, though, is what do we need to do?
Right. First of all, to begin with, thank you very much for the unique opportunity to be here and to be able to dialogue on many of the very pertinent issues that affect this country. And I think if your name, Inshira, is anything to go by, I'd like to say thank you very much, and Inshira.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Right. Now, within the broader issues that Africa challenges, many of them complex and difficult, or some very pertinent ones. One being climate change, the other one being youth unemployment, and then we're also going to have an excessively large urban population by the year 2050. And now, I think the challenges of Africa, and for that matter Ghana, are wide and diverse. And I think they're not the burdens of one man or woman alone, but each person has a stake in a particular component of it. And so within the broader scope of the issues that we have, I'm interested in youth unemployment. Now the question you would ask me is, how did you become interested in that? And if I ground that within the context of my story and where I've come from, I did my first 9 years of school in a place called Yeji. There was no running water, there was no electricity. And to emerge out of that place, first and foremost, to Adidoma Secondary School, which also was a day school and required walking so many miles to be able to get to school. And coming out of that place, being the only person to go to the University of Ghana, which was my first time in Accra. But by dint of hard work and the sheer grace of God, I was able to emerge out of there. And when I was in my third year at the university, I won the green card lottery and emigrated to the United States. Now, going back to that, what I've always thought about is the fact that what if I hadn't won the lottery? You know as well as I do that we have an excessively large youth population in the country that are facing youth unemployment. And Ghana, without a doubt, is just a microcosm of the overarching issue within the African continent. And so for me, the fact that I share a background or a beginning that's pretty much inextricably linked to many of the issues that a lot of young people face, because I know that in as much as I grew up in faraway Yeji or didn't grow up with electricity or running water, my story is part of the larger Ghanaian issue, because you know how it feels to be frustrated by one thing or another. You know many of the challenges we face with our transportation systems and things of the sort. But I think I'm at a point where I want to shy away, one way or the other, from excessively apportioning blame. And because I know that this isn't entirely, if we left it entirely to the device of government, it would be very difficult. And this is not an NDC issue, this is not an MPP issue, this is a Ghanaian issue. And so that's how I got interested in youth unemployment. And it's the very problem within the broader scope of all the issues we have that I'm passionate about.
Wow, that's interesting stuff. It leads me to get your thoughts on the world over, even in the most advanced economies. If you take your G7, you'd still find that they have issues with youth unemployment, and they also have issues with, for the lack of a better expression, putting the young people on the right track to be ready to handle the future that's upon us. If you look around, what are the parallels that you can draw on that you think, if we tried in our own space, albeit with our own unique challenges, we would see some strides? What are your thoughts?
That's an interesting question. The real issue, I think, is that the issue of youth unemployment has multidisciplinary causes. And I think it's important for us to be able to decode the various components that actually contribute to it, so that we're able to, one way or the other, have different people, different experts, people with different know-hows and skill sets tackling those diverse components of it. Now, I'm interested more in the educational system. From my research and also my experiences growing up here, I think we have an education system that completely belies many of the skill sets, the expertise that you need to be able to be successful in the contemporary world. Why do I say that? You know as well as I do that our system is excessively intent on rote memorization as opposed to the acquisition of practical skills. And you could make a compelling argument that that is a carryover from colonialism. But they've been gone for a while, and we can't apportion our blame to them for far too long. And so from what I do know is that there's a sort of mismatch between the skills that young people need and the demands of the job market. Secondly, there is, I would say, a dearth, a paucity of innovation and entrepreneurship skills that young people should be acquiring while they're in school. Because I think when we're growing up, we're sold the mythology, the myth that if we pursued education and give it our all and work very, very hard, we could, in many ways, extricate ourselves from the shackles of poverty. And I, for one, was part of that the students who sort of bought into that overarching idea. Now, but the reality is that we need to be very, very honest with our people, that the amount of jobs that are produced within the economy is far less than the graduates we're producing. And if you juxtapose that over the long pull with population growth, which you and I know very well that by 2035 would increase excessively on the African continent. And Ghana is just a microcosm of that. So the education system, as I mentioned, an excessive reliance on rote memorization, an inability for young people to be able to acquire the innovation and entrepreneurship skills they need. And that also kind of borders on, I would say, the collectivistic Ghanaian ethos, which prides itself on, I would say, respect for authority and hierarchy and all of that. So if you would agree with me, I think it's fairly easy. It's fair to say that when we're growing up in schools, you just listen to the teacher. You're not allowed to think for yourself in many ways. You listen, you memorize, and then you go to class and regurgitate that. So over the long pull, people are sort of indoctrinated into the idea that you just need to listen. And I'm sure that I haven't worked in Ghana in a very long while, but last year, for instance, I was here. And I think there was a bit of a struggle for me to sort of strike a delicate balance between how do I remain true to being, verbose and being expressing my ideas and also respecting authority. And I think that's always a struggle for a lot of young people. So allowing many of these young people in Ghana to be able to imbibe the idea that, look, it is within your potentiality as an individual, as a Ghanaian, to think and to be able to begin to see that there are possibilities, and that I think for far too long that sort of the chasm within the education system has created young people that are, in many ways have bought into that, that idea. So that's some of the causes that I would say have contributed to it within the education system.
I fully appreciate that point, but if you would look at our development trajectory, where we've come from, pre-colonial times, history shows that we were great people, capable of doing great things.
Right.
And then we had colonial times, which came with its educational system. and then we've not evolved beyond that since. But if you look back and realize that we've had a number of programs, the Bretton Woods institutions, and there have been recommendations made to sort of evolve our education system, and it didn't depart from what was before colonialism ended.
Right.
Have we ourselves bought into an idea that was not fit for purpose simply because we needed help?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question, and I think that ties into the overarching arguments that have been made about for aid. Take colonialism aside, but if we are dependent on, as you mentioned, the Bretton Woods, which pretty much morph into bigger organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, if we're excessively reliant on aid, then we don't have the leeway in many ways to be able to decide how we want to be able to effectively apply those resources. And so if I am a policymaker in Ghana, and I do believe that this is the educational system that will help free this country from the prison of young people not being able to get the skills they need, but my donors then have conditionalities, and I'm being compelled to abide by their conditionalities as opposed to the realities on the ground, then it becomes very difficult, you know. And so I would argue, as you mentioned, that colonialism, there was a degree of carryover. And if you went to Legon or many of the other the universities we have in this country, there are books that are dated as far back as 1950. You know, the world has moved on from that, but how well are we moving on? How well are we latching on to the changes? Many of the things that have been, you know, introduced, you know, the fourth industrial revolution. So I think in many ways the educational system has failed us, and you can make a compelling case for the fact that those people have also contributed. Yeah. But until we free ourselves entirely, which ties into the overarching mantra of the current president, Nana Akufo-Addo, Ghana Beyond Aid, which I think is a laudable idea. If we're able to free ourselves from those shackles, then we'll be able to more effectively be able to say that we want to adopt this education system, which we think is very, very instrumental to students being able to acquire the skills they need, to free them, and to be able to be more innovative, so we can all lift this country from underdevelopment, which for far too long has been a problem that has bedeviled us.
The examples that if you were to list your top three economies that have prioritized youth development and empowerment, I'm sure from my very challenged knowledge point of view and purview, I wouldn't think that they did that off the back of aid. So would you say that the link between development and aid has to be inverse? That if we really want to go up, then we need to go down on aid?
Yeah, without a doubt. I think aid, it's fair to say that in many ways it's helped us to get to a level of development. But the opposite can be said, that it hasn't been able to fully help us extricate ourselves from underdevelopment. And a lot of scholars have written against that. William Easterly, in his book White Man's Burden, Dambisa Moyo challenged Bill Gates and many of the donors about the sheer inability for those resources to be able to help lift Africa from the quagmire of poverty. More so because a lot of the solutions are top-down. And I think in my earlier example, I mentioned that we don't have the leeway, the ability to say that this is exactly where we're going to appropriate those resources to, because we're being dictated to. And so a lot of people have argued that many of these institutions are just neoliberal institutions that are imperialistic in many ways. Because come to think of it, you and I can say that if there's no poverty, then there's no IMF, there's no World Bank. What would they be doing? And so there's been a lot of arguments against the fact that aid hasn't quite helped us. And more recently, the newcomer to the table, which is China, you know, and China is just dishing out resources at monumental scales. I think $60 billion dedicated to Africa. And in 2018, President Donald Trump came up with the Build Act, also wanting to dedicate about $60 billion to developing countries, Africa being a part of it. And with the coming of Angela Merkel and Theresa May, many are actually beginning to say that it's a kind of neo-colonialism, a kind of scramble for Africa. So these are all conversations that are being...
But this scramble has been on the cards forever. I mean, in spite of the independence wave of the late 50s into mid 60s, the scramble has always been there. It was as though the idea of ending colonialism and movement into democratic rule and independence was merely a facade. And so today, coming to that realization, what must we do? And I would like you to break this, your response in three levels.
Right.
So we've always had the top-down approach. If we inverted it,
Right.
what should the people at the bottom of the pyramid today be doing?
Right.
And the people in the middle, what do you expect them to do? What institutions need to do? What should governments be doing in order to ensure that we're reorienting young people to appreciate, one, that they're capable, that two, that they have what it takes,
Right.
and the resources that will build this country is here on the ground and within them. And all they need to do is to be able to stand and compete globally.
Right, right. Oh, that's an interesting question. First of all, you know as well as I do that, I mean, Ghana is without a doubt, a repository of a lot of natural resources. We have gold, diamonds, many times the largest producer of cacao in the world. More recently, the largest producer of gold ahead of South Africa. Now, when you think about that deeply and think about how much we get from that, right? I mean, I heard we get as little as maybe 2%. Now, we need those resources, first and foremost, to be self-reliant. And government needs money, a lot of money, to be able to pump a lot of these resources into many of the other segments of Ghana's economy, whether healthcare, education, and things of the sort. So first of all, that's the starting point. And one of the things that I was really impressed by very recently was a kind of unison between Ghana and La Côte d'Ivoire to determine the price of cacao.
That's right.
So that's the first starting point. We can do the same for gold, for cacao.
That's nothing new, someone would tell you, because Kwame Nkrumah did have that, you know. And again, you know, there's a lot of historical context which we can, you know, sit for a whole year around and just list. But where we find ourselves today, we're confronted with a rapidly evolving world because of the fourth industrial revolution, the digital age. How equipped are we? Or how equipped should we be? Or what do we need to put in place to ensure that in the next 15 years, we're able to create a critical mass of young people who can innovate, who have the skills to collaborate and think critically about our problems and provide solutions that not only lift themselves up, but also create wealth for other people.
Now, if the educational system is to be situated within that argument, I would say that we need a sort of revamp of the educational system, one that prides itself or sort of invests in innovation and entrepreneurship education. That's what I would vouch for.
Okay.
We should be, not only are you, if you're getting a bachelor's degree in sociology, we should be setting up labs, like innovation labs on campus, where we're equipping young people or giving them sort of the ability, the wherewithal, to be able to think to begin to think for themselves about many of the challenges we face. How would they be able to use those challenges more as opportunities so they can begin to find solutions to them? So I would start from the education system, which needs, if you agree with me, a massive revamp, so that there's a bit more of an insistence on the acquisition of technical skills. I think for far too long it's been on the acquisition of soft skills. That's the that's the place I would start. Secondly, I would want to see what is our core competency as a country, for instance, right? If our education prides itself more on the acquisition of social skills, then maybe that's our core competency. How do we leverage that within the global economic milieu? So we could say, okay, our people are very good naturally with hospitality. Ghanaians are kind people, they're very nice. Okay, so now let's begin to negotiate with all these big multinationals, the Googles, the IBMs, and all of them, to begin to have their call centers in Ghana. Ghanaians naturally are very good at that. So that's a second way I would want to see us do it. Because when you look at India, for instance, India has been able to more effectively utilize the core competency of the country, which is technology. So many of the IT firms, whether based in the US or over there, use a lot of Indian resources, and these give them jobs. I mean, even in Ghana, right here in Ghana, you would agree with me that a lot of the jobs are done in India. So we need to figure out what our core competency is. And then the other thing I would think about is the resources that we have. How do we build industries around that? Take the case of Korea, for instance, right? Over 60 years ago, Korea was an excessively poor country. A lot of Koreans were
Poorer than us.
Right, migrating to Germany and all of that. And then they found a resource and built sort of an industry around that. You have the Daewoo's, the Samsungs, and all of that. And last year I was in Korea. I was completely befuddled by just the sheer gravity of how they've been able to lift that country from poverty. That comes with, in many ways, sort of getting in the way of their collective victims ethos, because people now don't have the time to be able to hang out. So it's a give and take. So those are some of the solutions that I would want us to start thinking about very deeply. And over the long pull, how would those cascade into helping us free our country from this prison, which for far too long has been a problem.
Great insights, Mac. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I'm going to go back into learning what Mac thinks about when it comes to ensuring that we pull apart the educational system. Which areas do we start? Do we look at the middle belt, secondary level? Do we look at the higher education? Do we start with the basics? We'll be right back after this. You're welcome back to the Executive Lounge with me, Inshira Addo, and my guest, Mac Sarbah. He's a multidisciplinary scholar. He's a thinker, innovator, and a social entrepreneur. Mac, I did say I wanted to learn this from you before the break. Let's step into my hypothetical country,
Right.
called Ghana.
Right.
But what I would like is share 3 practical things that you would do differently about our education system today.
Right.
Bearing in mind that we have free senior secondary school education or senior
Right.
high school education. Are we placing the weight where it should be or elsewhere?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the educational challenges that we have in this country can be broken down into 3 components: access, quality, and relevance.
Okay.
In terms of access, I think the current government has done a pretty good job making senior secondary school education, free, which means that almost every other person who has the ability or obtain the grades will be able to get the education they need. Now, the quality is what I talked about earlier. Is the education we're getting meeting the needs of the economy? Is the education we're getting providing the young people with the skills, the requisite skills to be effective in the economy? And that also ties into relevance, right? How relevant is the education? Now, you wanted me to break it down into 3 things that you think could be done. Now, I think we need to make innovation and entrepreneurship education a component of our curriculum. I think a policy like that would be very vital, maybe right from the secondary school level up until people move into the universities, so that we're beginning to change mindsets about, look, if we're honest, we should be honest as a government, as a people, as politicians, and that the rate at which people are graduating exceeds the jobs we're able to produce. And that if we can, the other way we can help solve this would be if we bring the people that are most affected by it into the fold, so that they're not living in complete, they're not aware that, look, education wouldn't always lead you to the job you want, and that maybe if we drum home the importance of entrepreneurship and innovation, then young people will be able to acquire the skills they need. 2, we need innovation hubs, an ecosystem that actually fosters or enhances young people's predilection to entrepreneurship. And I think it has already begun with Will Senyo setting up the Impact Hub, which serves as a place that a lot of young people convene. So you're able to draw from the energies of many other people that are in your shoes, right? So if we had those on university campuses like Harvard does, I think for a very long time, Harvard had a problem of having people. We lost Bill Gates, we lost Mark Zuckerberg. And so I think they sat down and thought about the fact that, look, if we're losing many of our students because they have ideas and they don't have people who can nurture them, who can take them, handhold them, teach them how to go to market, the principles of business, then that's an alumni resource that, over the long pull, we're losing, because those can come back and provide us resources. So we need innovation hubs, I would say, planted within university systems as well. University of Ghana, UDS, Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, so that aside from your quintessential sociology and political science and classics that you're taking, you're also taking a mandatory, I would say, innovation and entrepreneurship education class. You might not end up being an entrepreneur, but you understand sort of the rudiments of how to run a business, so that in the event that something came up, you'll be
ready for it.
Right. Or even if you don't, I know that there's been a lot of complaints about the degree to which young people have been trained to have the communication and leadership skills to do that the job market actually requires. And I think a rigorous program of the sort, even if you don't go to market, you're not able to take your ideas from inception to market, you would have acquired in many ways communication, leadership, and ability to appreciate ambiguity and failure and all of that. Because I think we're very quick to celebrate, grand success. But beyond that, or at the back office, I would like to call it, is a lot of work. And so that work ethic and that sort of preponderance to allowing people to fail needs to be drummed home, so that people aren't excessively reliant on the fact that I only need to be successful,
Well, but I mean, it's quite interesting. Let's take a step away from the policy space and jump into culture. And this is precipitated largely by, the admission that as a society, we don't encourage people to feel very well.
Right.
In a typical setting at home, a child comes home, or a bunch of children at the end of the school term. Some do well, some don't. The one that doesn't get a pat on the back to say, you can do better next year.
Right.
You get thrown in a little corner or under the bus and said, so look at how well these ones are doing, and you're the worst one of the lot. How do we reignite a culture that celebrates even failing? Because success really is a rebound from failure.
Right.
Nobody became world champion at their first bout.
Right.
So you how do we change society's acculturation and the mindset about failure, about collaboration, about critical thinking? Of course, we don't have a society that encourages young people standing flat-footed and looking dead, older people dead in the eye and asking questions and disagreeing with them. So the way you've talked about delicately balancing being able to remain verbose but respecting authority.
Right.
It's not something that's it's rare here.
Right.
But if you look at the cultures where you have all the labs, innovation spaces at the tertiary level, I think they work largely because the people are accultured in a way that right from a very young age, kids are doing lemonade stands outside their houses during the summer. You don't see that happening here.
Right.
How do we re-engineer the society?
Right. That's an interesting question. But before I get to that, I want to make the third point about.
Oh yeah,
Right,
see,
right.
I was just lapping it all up.
Right.
Go on.
So the third thing I'd want us to do is to be able to create a fertile ground where a lot of the research that's actually conducted here by researchers can actually be tested on markets. You know what I mean? We're able to equip our university researchers who actually come up with ideas. So those ideas do not just get locked in university libraries and die over there. But how do we create an avenue so that they'll be more entrepreneurial? So that's one of the other things I was thinking about. And then to your question about Ghanaian culture priding itself excessively on, I would say, conformity, and humility. And I think I did suffer a little bit when I moved to the United States, where you go for an interview and they ask you to tell me about yourself, or have you worked on a team? And then you focus excessively on the entire team as opposed to what you have done. So that required a bit of rewiring myself. And I think that, as you mentioned earlier, is contingent upon how we were brought up. And I think it behooves our parents and the education system to be able to allow us, as I mentioned, to be a bit more adventurous in expressing ourselves. So that, you know, I remember growing up, if you were to express your opinion to your father, you would be punished excessively. So we need, I would say, the psyche of the Ghanaian needs to be changed a little bit. And that's fairly difficult. How do we do that, you know? It could be, I could take on the challenge of, I'm going to start a campaign about the need for Ghanaian parents to allow their children to be a bit more verbose, a bit more articulate about their needs, their wants, right from the get-go, so that when they get to 18, 20, when they're in universities and things of the sort, it becomes second nature somehow. Because it's very difficult to change who you are when for far too long that's the predominant way of behaving. So our parents also have a role to play in that. The education system has a role to play in that. And when you look at workplaces, for instance, I think a lot of times a lot of people are yes men. They don't challenge their bosses and their superiors. And I mean, it's very easy for me to sit here and say that, why don't you do that? But we also know that has its genesis in sort of the difficulty of finding employment. So when you do, you don't want to
leave it in a hurry.
Right. So it is a really complex issue,
right.
And I think it has multi-dimensional components. That's all of us parents, you know, the workplaces, educational institutions, even policymakers can play a role in helping us solve.
Your example of India. India's approach was deliberate. India had a plan,
right.
And they wanted to see certain milestones achieved over a certain period of time.
Right.
So India's rise as a global destination for some of the sharpest technological minds didn't happen by accident.
Right.
So if we're going to begin to dream, how would you say we go about it? Especially in a country that has had, like, we probably have the foremost history and pedigree for discontinuing things just because the head that wears the crown changes.
Right. Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, that's a fair point. I think I would totally acquiesce with you that ever since Kwame Nkrumah rose to free this country from slavery and from colonialism, over the long pull, a lot of things have changed. But as I mentioned, I think it's important for all of us, government, you know, civil servants, all of us, to sit down and begin to unpack the core causes of the issue. And then we need a plan, because it wouldn't happen by chance. And first, I want to commend the current government for many of the initiatives, like, you know, Nation Builders Corps, National Board for Small Scale Industries, that have all been involved in thinking very deeply about youth unemployment. But I think we need to sit down as a nation and begin to tease out the various components of youth unemployment, the various causes of it, and then begin to draw a plan, short term, medium term, long term. What do we want to achieve? How do we go about doing that? Because these are very serious conversations to be had, you know, as well as I do. So I think that's what I would say. But within my first thing I would say would be, because I'm an aficionado of education, I would say we begin from the education system, you know, and begin to revamp it to make sure that it's pretty much in line with many of the changes that are sort of the air of change that's blowing around the world. As you mentioned earlier, the fourth industrial revolution, bringing with it technological change, artificial intelligence, all of these things are very, very pertinent issues that are being discussed. And so, yeah, that's I would say that I want to start from the education system, which I believe is also a stronger component of the causes of the problem. That aside, policy and many other components have also contributed to it.
Comparative advantage, sort of finding your station in life as a nation.
Right.
We're blessed with a wonderful coastline, a great middle belt, and very awesome savanna. I mean, there should be no reason why Ghana should be where it is.
Right.
And that's the argument lots of people have made. There has also been schools of thought that all of these interventions, like the Nation Builders Corps and all the other stuff that are happening to try and mop up youth unemployment, actually a piecemeal and may only treat the symptom and not the root cause.
Right.
I hear you say, let's look at a plan. Let's have a plan.
Right.
But how do we rally behind a plan? How do we rally behind, and I'll go back to the India example again. There's been changes of government in India, but there has been a steadfast journey to creating, first it was a technological hub, and then they became the pharmaceutical hub. Now they're pushing and trying to jump into the space race and all of that. Why is it that others can have a singular vision and get other people to buy into it, even if they're not around, and we don't seem to be able to do that? Where do we change that?
Right. No, I think it has its genesis in the nature and the complexities of our politics, where there's so much of an insistence on sort of charting out a course that will help people win elections. And so we divorce ourselves from changing plans. If we have a plan, I think it's important to stick with it and to think about over the long pool, whether or not I'm NDC or NPP, would this plan be able to help free our country from underdevelopment? Will this plan be able to help Ghana get to the next level? So first, I think our politics needs to divorce itself from that, and an excessive reliance on winning elections as opposed to how do we dedicate ourselves. We're going to need a lot of sacrifice. Where if I'm the president, I'm not thinking only about winning elections, and that sort of forces me or compels me to overhaul many of the policies that other governments would have put in place. Sticking with it, if in the long run it'll help the country grow. So I think that's the first starting point, so that we're not just one person comes in power for 4 years or 8 years, draws up a plan, the other comes in and gets rid of it because it doesn't fit into the overarching election strategy. So I think that's a major drawback that we need to pay attention to.
I agree with you. I mean, to think that we're a year away from 2020,
Right.
And at some point, I think we had a Vision 2020, which was launched, I think, in 1997 or so, and all of that has changed. Just as we get ready for our final break before the end of the show, help me appreciate where you think young people should be placed in this dynamic, in this recreation of the new Ghana, if I could call it that.
Right.
The Ghana that has a plan that we all follow, the Ghana that has a clear, defined KPIs that we want to, some milestones that we want to see happen.
Right.
Where should young people get into politics? Should they be more vocal? How would you see the people for whom all these things ought to be done for playing a role?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think you would acquiesce with me that there's a tale of two Ghanas, for instance. The Ghana that a lot of people are doing quite well and the Ghana that other people aren't. And I think one of the things that I've always been extremely flabbergasted about is the fact that we pride ourselves on the collective. Yet when we ascend to positions of authority, we tend to forget that collectivistic ethos, which was sort of drummed home when we were growing up. And I know for sure that many of our leaders, and that's not to place the blame on them squarely, drive around town. They see many of our citizens, wallowing in frustration and anger and despondence and all of that. I think it's important that we come together as a collective and begin to think about, okay, how do we draw young people into the fold? If policies are being made by government, it's not just the technocrats behind the scenes who are doing that, but we have a dialogue with university students, go to churches. What are the predominant issues in this country, and how do we tap into their energies, their talents, their skills, so that we can draw a plan that's inclusive of everyone? So that it's not just the bureaucrats doing that, but also the young people who, you'd agree with me, are the ones that suffer the brunt of many of the issues that we face. So I think it's important for the collective action, not only on the part of government, but also young people, all of us coming together and beginning to ideate and dialogue on the issues that face this country.
Wonderful. We're going to take our final break. When we come back, we're going to learn a little more about life in Yeji, Adidome, but more importantly, the value system that can help us get the most out of the young people today. If we're going to secure the future, we've got to have to start now.
Right.
All right. We'll be back after this break, and share some more with you with my guest, Max Sarbah. Welcome back to the Executive Lounge with me, Inshira Ado, and my guest, Max Sarbah. Quite an interesting conversation, unfortunately, with very little time. I could talk to you all day. I would like, as we get to the end of this, dialogue, to get your thoughts on, for every society, there's a singular chord or a series of chords that bind them together. When you mention Germany, the sense that most people get is efficiency.
Punctuality.
You mention Japan, honor, precision. And what are the value systems that you think we ought to start cultivating today if we're going to have a better future with our young people competing and being global champions?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think first and foremost, we need a degree of selflessness within the country where people are okay wanting to come to the table and say, okay, for the next 10 to 20 years, we want to be able to be selfless so that we can build a very, very strong and powerful nation with all the resources that we have. Because you know as well as I do that the collectivistic ethos which defines us has, I would say, provides the juice for all of us. All of us, I mean, to be able to come down and begin to think about, look, we need to be selfless. Let's let that permeate everything we do. I would say that would be the first thing. Two, it's common knowledge that most Africans like to be late, you know. I think we need to attach a degree of punctuality to the things we do and attach a degree of seriousness. We need to focus very deeply on, I would say, leveraging the resources that we have, but more assiduously, more intentional. Because it's fairly easy to just have a rhetoric about we're going to do X, Y, Z, but without a concerted effort, without seriousness, without intentionality, it would be very, very difficult to do that. So, Stu, I think we need to be very intentional. We need to be very intentional about what this country is all about. Because, I mean, you will agree with me that Ghana for a very long time has been a beacon of hope in the oasis of lost hope for many African countries. And we need to take that a step further, you know, because a lot of countries are rising to the challenge. So, secondly, we need seriousness, intentionality. First, we need to leverage the collectivity ethos to begin to think about our brothers and sisters. I'm a brother's keeper. If we want to imbibe that, then it means that the struggle of a child in Tamale is my struggle. The pain of a university graduate in Adidome is a collective pain. The sickness of a mother who doesn't have access to a hospital in, say, Adan is our sickness as a nation. So we need intentionality, I would say.
Okay, so intentionality, and we have to be mindful and selfless.
Right, and then I would also say that in our workplaces, we need to attach a degree of hard work. If you look at Korea, Japan, I think what really, really freed them was, aside from them actually coming up with a plan, is just hard work.
Proper sweaty brows.
Grind it out. Like we're not going to do, of course, 9 to 5, which is okay, but we're not at that stage where we can have that latitude, that freedom to go out and just chill. We need work, extreme work, people that are dedicated. Look, in the next 30 years, we want to lift Ghana from where it is. We create a marker for where we want to be and work assiduously at it. Okay. I believe that work is very central to many achievements. Right.
Let's focus on you. Growing up in Yeji, I've been there once.
Right. Interesting.
I think about 5 years or so ago. It's a beautiful place, but yes, clearly underdeveloped compared to Accra, Kumasi, compared to many parts of the country.
Right.
In spite of not having all these things around you, which would be suitable aids for growing up and developing. How did you as an individual manage to strike out and make it to the university?
Yeah, I think it's very easy to celebrate only the success of the person that many people would regard as a hero. But in the background, there's also a lot of people who played a pivotal role. I think the first person I would like to think, which I think is the main hero in my journey, is my father. My father was a disciplinarian who, even in the area in which we lived, he would take it upon himself to walk into houses and tell parents to take their children to school. So my father placed a premium, an excessive premium at that, on education. So even though we weren't living in the best of places, in the evenings my father would sit in the front of the house and we would study till very late. And then I would then wake up at dawn because he would wake me up. So I think I imbibed that they need to work really hard. So even when I graduated and I was accepted to Bishop Herman College, and there wasn't enough resources for me to go, then I ended up at the Duma Secondary School. I sort of had that self-belief that if I put in enough work, I too could rise out of that and make something out of my life. And I want to credit many of the teachers who played a role, because it's fairly easy to say that, look, Mac was able to rise from the Duma Secondary School to Harvard University, but I didn't do that alone. It was through the collective work of teachers who volunteered, classmates were encouraging, family members, friends, and many people along the way that I can't mention. So yeah, that I would say is sort of the genesis and the main reason for.
How would you advise our viewers of making a repeatable process of young people striking out in spite of what they don't have?
Right. Now, first, I think it's important to know where you're coming from, and it's important to take stock of that. But the inability to have resources shouldn't get in the way of you dreaming and setting goals and fighting at that. And I think for me, just the sheer resilience to say that this is what I want to achieve. And I remember actually growing up, I listened to BBC Radio, and I heard Cambridge. I think I was around 16 years old, and I said I wanted to go there. So it was just a mythology, the dream, the vision, and I worked really hard. And I think it's fairly easy to say, look, this person is brilliant. But if you think about it, a lot of hard work actually goes into, the person's public persona. Like you, for instance, you're known for your verbosity, your ability to express yourself, which has brought you very far in your career. But I could very well say that you put in a lot of work, reading excessively, making sure that you're fine-tuning many of the tiny details that are over the long haul converge on making you who you are. So hard work is important. And also you need to be very determined. And in the process, you're going to fail. Failure should be celebrated. Because I think earlier we talked about how there's an excessive insistence on success. But we need to also celebrate failure, so that young people don't just think that people they look up to are heroes or people who just emerge, I would say a unicorn, for instance, right? So we need to celebrate failure, and we need to drum home the importance of young people failing, so that would actually push them, it'll encourage them to work hard. And even if they fail, it's okay. Go at it. Keep trying. Because I myself have done that. To tie that into my story, I think when I first got to the United States, I applied to Columbia University the first time, and I was rejected. But I didn't give up. I just sat down and looked effectively at my application, and I was like, took a comprehensive look. I was like, what can I do better next time? I did it, and I was accepted. So it's important to not give up when you're in the face of adversity or failure, but keep pushing, be relentless, develop the resilience. And many of these young people who actually go through difficulties day in and day out, channel the energy, the apathy, the anger, the frustration into your goals. And I think if you dedicate yourself to it, some way, somehow, I kind of believe that there's sort of a metaphysical force that brings things in your way to help you achieve it. Speaking of that, I'll talk a little bit about the Harvard article. And I think it was very megalomaniac, and he said that Ghanaian guy is going to go back and solve youth unemployment. Initially, I had a bit of a pushback, because I thought it wasn't sensitive to the cultural sensitivities of Ghana. And so I actually pushed them a little bit to fine-tune the article to match the complexities of the culture. And they were excessively surprised. But when I sat down and I thought deeply about it, I actually prayed about it. And if you're familiar with the biblical knowledge of Moses, at the burning bush, when God asked him, "What's in your hands?"
I have a rod.
Right. and God said, "Cast it on the ground." And he did. And he turned into a snake. And God said, "Pick it up." And with that, he was able to lead the Israelites out of bondage. Now, I don't want to come here with a chip on my shoulder thinking that, I've come here to solve the issue. What I do believe is that a person could be the voice, the conduit through which a lot of these things will be expressed, so that the importance of it is beginning to gain ground within the country. But it will require, as I mentioned, collective action. Policymakers, university administrators, media people, all of us beginning to think deeply about, look, let's sit down and draw a plan, and all of us working assiduously at it can be able to elevate Ghana to the pinnacle of international development, which for far too long has been our goal.
Thank you very much, Mac. From Yeji to Adidome to University of Ghana, then to Columbia, Cambridge, Harvard, and on to the Executive Lounge. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So for me, 5 things I'm taking away from this conversation. Number 1 is that you must dream in spite of where you find yourself. You could be in a hole somewhere with no light, but you can dream big. And when you're done dreaming, you've got to start doing. And that's the hard work. You've got to be consistent. You've got to be push yourself to the limit and remember where you've come from and where you want to get to. You keep going till you get there. You will fall along the way, and that deals with failure. If you fail 7 times, rise up 8 times so that you can keep pushing. No one has succeeded just from the start. You're going to have to get through a new devil on every level. Number 4 is that we've got to have to start developing in ourselves the desire to plant a seed that becomes a tree, knowing fully well that we may not ever sit under that tree, that we must be posterity minded. We must think about how the future we want will be built and do what it takes to build that. And the final thing is that we all need to rally behind the flag being the country, the flag being a common vision, the flag being that we don't want young people leaving this continent and getting on dinghies and dying in the Mediterranean or across the Sahara. So we do what is required. That if you're a politician, if you're a government, we follow one vision and execute it to the hilt. I'm Inshira. Again, thank you very much for tuning in, and thanks to my team and the team at Villa Monticello, and to you for tuning in every weekend. We're back again next week with more on the Executive Lounge. As always, go forward, make rain. Shalom. Is this something you learned? Were you born an entrepreneur?
You got to start small.
I have not allowed being a woman to hold me back.
Credibility is not just making money, it's about making sure that people trust what you're doing.
Law practice is not only about going to court, it's about advice.
It's very difficult to hire somebody who's not motivated and then make them motivated.
One of the things that I'm known for is integrity.
They have to see you as a person of integrity.
Welcome to the Executive Lounge. I'm Inshira Adam.